This is the Banana Data Podcast, a podcast hosted by Data IQ. I'm Trevani.
And I'm Chris.
And in our bi-weekly episodes, we'll discuss the good, the great, and the ugly of AI. If you're craving even more, check out our 15-minute Banana Bites discussions on Data IQ's LinkedIn and Twitter every Wednesday at 2 p.m. EST. Today, we're looking at AI around the world, highlighting how countries like Sweden, Vietnam, and Kenya are supporting innovation within and across their borders. So, Chris, we talk about AI a lot on this podcast. It's almost like this is a podcast about AI.
As if.
But I think one thing we tend to do is talk about AI from a certain part of the world. A lot of the developments, a lot of the exciting things we like to discuss are very much in that Silicon Valley, New York, startup kind of area. And there's so many other interesting places where AI is happening and, rapidly developing. So I thought today maybe we could shift our focus a little bit and look at AI in other parts of the world.
Yeah, AI is occurring all around the globe. And it's going to be impossible for us in one episode to be talking about absolutely everything that's out there in the world in AI. But yeah, I really think this is something that we should talk about and try to focus in on some of these different countries that are doing some really cool things that maybe we haven't heard about.
And I think when we think about AI in the world, we default to China because arguably they are rising as a sort of new AI superpower because of the way the government has invested so much into both infrastructure, into education, into lots of creativity and ingenuity around AI, which is contrasting, I think, a lot with the way the US came to build AI out. The US model for AI did have some government involvement early on, but the most innovation has really come out of Silicon Valley and the startup ecosphere.
And that's important to notice, too, is that whether it's China or the US or any of these other countries in the world, these strategies may be different. There may be different types of funding, different places have different things at top of mind in terms of what they're doing with the AI research. But this doesn't necessarily mean that there's a right or wrong way to do things or that we're necessarily claiming that there is a better or worse way, but that there's just differences among these different strategies.
Right. And I think the difference in those strategies is a function of the different countries, their own government structures, their own sort of culture and understanding of technology in the new world. Yeah, it's just like how there's multiple forms of government around the world. There's going to be multiple forms of AI development as well. So we do know, right, that there's at least a primarily public funded model of AI development and a primarily private funded model of AI development. And what I think we're going to see today as we discuss the countries we've chosen to talk about is that there's now a shift towards this public-private partnership when it comes to AI. I think that's natural, especially because for so much of the work that needs to get done, people need access to certain infrastructure that is necessarily going to be public. Electricity, that's just a very base thing, beyond the other things like high-speed internet and data centers and the like. To guide the conversation, we decided to look at 3 specific countries that we felt like were not, really talked about in the overall AI space, but had a lot of very interesting and different approaches that they've been building on for some time. So today we're going to cover Sweden, Vietnam, and Kenya. And I know, Chris, you had some interesting thoughts to share on Sweden. So if you want to kick us off.
So with Sweden, I think one of the things that I found quite alluring about what they're doing is that they actually released a national approach for artificial intelligence. It was a very long guiding document that outlined the government's assessments of what the country needs to do as they look towards the future of the next 10 years of AI development. But although it's quite vague, the government has invested about 40 million krona, which is the currency there in Sweden, to this effort. And the framework around which they are discussing AI is around what they're going to do with trainings, with research, with innovation and use, and infrastructure. So they do touch along quite a vast variety of topics. I feel like Sweden is taking their time in ensuring that they have a very stable foundation off which they're going to base the rest of their AI research for the next 10 years.
Yeah, I think that's the important part here for Sweden is the AI research. Obviously, there are a lot of companies in Sweden doing very interesting things with AI, but really for me, the strength of Sweden's AI is in the intense sort of academic and technical approaches to new methods.
Mm-hmm.
That's really their strong point. And you see a lot of very good research coming out of Swedish universities.
And not only that, they specifically call out in their research bullet points here that they also need strong collaboration between businesses and the public sector in relation to this research. So I feel like Sweden is trying to take a multi-pronged approach where they're looking at AI from different realms and trying to address all of them for the future.
I mean, that's good. I mean, I wouldn't say that they're totally ignoring, right, the private side of things, but that their main focus seems to be on innovation from a very algorithmic sense versus a place like Silicon Valley where the focus is on how can we use AI to create very front-end user-focused experiences.
And I think another important point to note here is that they're also very much cognizant of the fact that this is going to be in the hands of humans. And a lot of the discussion in their, I guess, manifesto is about the training about how you use AI and in a non-technical sense as well. So there is an algorithmic push, especially from a research standpoint, but they specifically call out responsible application of the technology. So I really like that, especially given a lot of the other things we've talked about on the podcast before.
It's interesting when we think about this government and private union when it comes to AI. You're seeing a similar kind of use case in Vietnam. You know, not only are they doing this collaboration between the government and really strong academics, things like Hanoi University of Technology or even Stanford, but they're also trying to bring a level of innovation that they're hoping will make them an emerging leader in the field. And so they have this program actually called AI for VN that is really facilitating all of these connections between the public and the private. I think that's whenever we see issues around development, whether it's AI, whether it's manufacturing, whatever it is, historically in the world, the disconnect between public and private is usually the strongest sticking point because you'll have private sector growing at its own speed because it has the external resources, it has money it can bring in, while the government tends to lag behind. And I think what's good about places like Vietnam and Sweden is that they're very intentionally bringing those two sides together.
Yeah, and it seems like there's more of a planning phase. I guess there's two different broad buckets of acting now and seeing what happens later and adjusting, or planning ahead of time and trying to think of absolutely everything you can to address it up front as you proceed forth in the future. And it's kind of difficult because either way, there's benefits and detractions. It's impossible to predict the future, no matter how much you try to study statistics and do so as accurately as possible. But I kind of like that idea of plan ahead and plan for your plans to fail.
I think Vietnam recognizes as well that it's struggling in terms of certain resources like databases and infrastructure, as well as the foundations for good AI business. But the government itself is recognizing it as AI as like the fourth revolution, if you will. And so for them, you know, making that connectivity between government and private, plus the idea that they're sending out so much talent to learn AI and learn new applications and do research abroad, I think the goal is for them to eventually have those folks come back to develop those AI resources. But I do think that there is a tension there of, will those folks really come back, or will they end up staying where they are? And, you know, will this be a new form of brain drain for Vietnam?
But it is interesting to note, though, the fact that they are allowing for this exploration outside of the Vietnam country. I think that facilitates this collaborative effort. And if you're consistently always talking to the exact same 5 people in your life, as we've talked about before, you might fall into this trap of an echo chamber. But there are a variety of elements that are of importance that you may not even consider if you don't look outside that 5-person friend group. So I really enjoy that aspect in terms of the strategy here. To no avail, it might turn out to be the case that all those members don't come back to Vietnam, but in general, they're bringing the ideas from Vietnam elsewhere. So even if that were to be the case, I think that it's a vast positive.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely a very valid model for building out your AI base, right? For building out the community of people who know about AI, who can practice AI, who can research and push it forward. I think that when we look towards countries in sub-Saharan Africa, they're actually taking an alternative approach. And that kind of brings me to the other country that I wanted us to discuss today, which is Kenya.
Can you tell me more about that?
Oh, gosh. Yes. Always with the puns. I can tell you more. I don't think that. Did I get that right? Anyway, so the thing that's really interesting about Kenya is that it recognizes AI as super crucial for its overall development, but it's taken a little bit of a different tack, especially different from Vietnam and Sweden. So the government has invested quite a lot of money into AI, and there was a task force created in 2018 that's going to give the government recommendations on how to harness this new power in the next 5 years. And in 2019, the government allocated over $60 million to fund a Kenya data center that will actually provide cloud services to both public and private users. So that not only is the private sphere equipped with the technology and infrastructure to actually grow and become a startup hub, but also the public itself, the government side of the data center can also make use of cloud technologies and growth in that way. I think that's a really important factor here is that for Kenya, AI is not just something that they want to develop with the help of government resource, but that they want their government itself to be using AI more.
So correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like the strategy that Kenya is taking is a little bit more democratizing the AI effort and facilitating putting it in the hands of as many people as possible, both in the public and private sectors.
Yeah. And I think, going back to my point earlier is that there are a lot of grassroots organizations that are popping up, and the government is seeing that. But the grassroots organizations that are coming up, things like Kenya.ai, are really about connecting experts and creating data science education opportunities in the country itself so that people don't need to travel abroad to go and get this education, that they can actually be learning and teaching from one another. And, that has also led to a lot of other kinds of meetup groups and grassroots groups like Women in Data Science. We spoke with one of the leaders of that group in a prior episode. She mentioned that there's a burgeoning community in Nairobi for women doing data science. And so I think the government's trying to realize that there's no reason to send folks out to wherever when they have so much talent right there that can be really well mobilized.
So when I was taking a look at the Kenya.ai initiative, one of their values is this collaboration. And I love this quote from the website where they say, "Alone you move faster, but together we go further." And I really like that idea of fostering this collaboration within the country using, some of these initiatives. But what about collaboration outside of the country or with different parties? Again, trying to avoid that echo chamber that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, we've been talking about all of these countries in sort of like a vacuum to say that this is what Sweden's doing, this is what Vietnam's doing. But in fact, a lot of countries, Kenya included, are collaborating with each other. So, for example, the data center that is being built out in Kenya is actually the contract to build that out is actually with Huawei, the Chinese sort of telecom company. So it's interesting to see China, really supporting the investments in AI in the sub-Saharan region, especially because China's been investing in a lot of African nations for some time, especially in terms of oil pipelines and other kinds of infrastructure work. So to see that country now moving into supporting AI development is good, but then also, raises the question of what is China ultimately going to get out of helping Kenya get its data centers off the ground?
Theoretically, this has to be mutually beneficial in some way.
Something that comes to mind is the Chinese government working with the Zimbabwean government to get more pictures of African people into their facial recognition databases in exchange for a facial recognition tool that Zimbabwe could use to do policing or what other enforcement in the country. And that's on paper sounds good, but obviously raises again a lot of the flags that we've been talking about on this show around ethical AI, about responsible uses of AI, and whether or not, that is the right application of such technology. So I think that like, even though we're talking about these countries in a vacuum, we're talking about their development and how they're pushing forward, it's important to also recognize that these same questions around responsible uses and ethical uses, data privacy, all those same concerns must reflect in the way that these countries are developing their AI moving forward. So I think it's great that all of these countries, not just the three that we've mentioned here, but a lot around the world are building out really strong and interesting AI infrastructures and investing for the future. But given that we've seen how things can go wrong or how this technology can create sort of unintended negative consequences, I also think it's a really good opportunity for countries to start building the right way, start building with an eye towards ethical use, responsible use of these technologies.
And with Sweden, they are certainly bringing up these points of AI research and process development and travel and smart cities, healthcare, finance, but they do take the time in their national approach to highlight the fact that regardless of what's going on in the research, whether it's through universities or the public or private sector, Sweden needs a strong AI content and a non-technical education for the purposes specifically to have broad and responsible application of all of this technology.
Yeah, that non-technical education is like a very critical piece, because I'm sure in Sweden that they are thinking about this, but I haven't seen any such similar language for Kenya or Vietnam, right? And the focus there is we want the tech skills. We want the like hardcore science, data science, algorithm stuff. And frankly, they should also be thinking a little bit more about the non-technical. And I think there are places in Kenya that are thinking about like how to use data for good. So I hope that those other kinds of conversations are also not completely missing.
And, we're thinking about this on a macro level, right? So we're talking about global AI and how all these countries are doing this, but we should not forget, as always, that on the micro level, for the day-to-day of a data scientist, we should always have these things at top of mind as well.
Yeah, and that's, again, not to say that these countries aren't thinking about it. And certainly we're seeing this kind of focus towards creating non-technical and responsibly minded data science thought across the globe, right? The US, you're seeing a lot of this happen in Europe now. Whether or not we're seeing a lot of them in China could be argued, especially around sort of data privacy questions. But it is still very top of mind for people. So I think that for these countries that are now developing their new platforms or building out their infrastructure, it's important to really verbalize it, like the way Sweden has, so that it is explicit and clear for everyone to know that these are our priorities.
And realistically, we're only just scratching the surface here of these three countries, let alone the entire globe and what's going on with AI. And hopefully this inspires our listeners to do a little bit more research about what's going on in various different countries around the world. I know I certainly got quite interested here, and that's just the beginning.
And now it's time for that part of the show where we discuss complex data science topics in simple terms. So, Chris, can you describe GDPR in English, please?
So GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation, and that's a mouthful, so most people just stick with GDPR. But what is it? Basically, it represents quite a large change in the European Union's data protection rules that were adopted in April of 2016 and began being enforced in May of 2018. And the new rules affect not only companies operating within the European Union, but also those that store information on European citizens. So the impact has the potential to affect how the whole world thinks about data. The impetus behind this regulation is quite simple. It's to protect our personal information. Nowadays, more and more of our personal information is being collected, stored, even traded by companies and governments, like our gender, race, name, address, our purchases, or even the last place we went out to lunch. Arguably, a lot of that information is sensitive. Under the GDPR, basically speaking, organizations will have to identify lawful reasoning behind why they collect and store this type of information, and moreover, ensure that they're keeping it safe and secure. You might have noticed recently that you're getting a lot of emails or newsletters from various organizations you may have only interacted with a couple of times, and that's simply because they're trying to inform your consent on the information they may have stored about you. And they're doing so because there can be serious legal penalties for data misuse. For example, if a company suffers from a data breach, they could be liable to pay a fine of up to 4% of their annual turnover, which could be millions or even billions of dollars. Overall, there are a bunch of principles behind the GDPR that aim to protect us as individuals, but there are still some ongoing debates of what this looks like in the long run. Will companies have to hire more staff to ensure the GDPR rules are met? Will prices go up in order to cover costs? Can we really quantify the price of keeping our personal information safe and ethically handled? All this can be ambiguous and uncomfortable, and while we might not have answers to all these questions right now, one thing is for sure. The GDPR is opening up a serious dialogue about the use of sensitive data by companies and is an attempt to empower individuals to rights that they may not have explicitly had before.
Before we head out, it's time for our new segment that highlights AI pioneers and innovators in the field. Today, we're talking about Heba Ali, a research scientist who works on creating accessibility maps using crowdsourced information from smartphones. She's developed algorithms that can use input from spatial recognition sensors on our phones to automatically build maps that alert people to things like a missing pedestrian crossing sign or broken curb ramps. Dr. Ali is currently a research scientist at Amazon and got her PhD in computer science from the University of Maryland.
That's all we've got today in the world of banana data. We'll be back with another podcast in 2 weeks. But subscribe to the Banana Data newsletter to read these articles and more like them. And we've got links for all the articles we discussed today in the show notes below. Until next time.